Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. And in this chat, I'd like to talk about how standards of living in the West for 99.9% of the population have decreased quite considerably over the last 50 years, and particularly since globalization began to really take off in the 1990s. So let's look at how and to what extent the standards of living have declined and the cost of living has increased, and look at some of the things that could possibly be done to address these issues. Now, I don't want anyone to think that market forces are driving anything these days. Pretty much everything you buy, every price that you pay is being set up, rigged, stacked by the globalist cabal, and very little now is that you pay intrinsic value or market price, or market competition decides very little. Maybe you get two corner stores across each side of the road from each other, and maybe they compete on price, that sort of thing. But the people who are competing on price or the best value, they're at the bottom end of the market, and they're the ones that are making nickels and dimes anyway. They're the ones that have got to get all their relatives from some dirt poor basket case country to come and work for 2/5 of fuck all and live 20 to a room. They're the ones that are having to play the competition game. The rest of the people that are pulling the strings, the globalist cabal, they're not competing. They're not competing for their jobs. They're not competing for their very, very generous paychecks or their performance bonuses or anything like that. So just to set the stage there. Now, if we look at the paycheck of say an average worker in the West, and you could apply this pretty much in any Western country in the day. Then the purchasing power of the wage in say 1970, or even if we take a basket of 5 years, 1970 to 1975 as an example, and then we look at that, say the last 5 years up to this year of average wages for a Western worker, and we can see that the purchasing power of the paycheck, when we particularly include the essentials of life, things like flats or televisions are cheaper now in net terms than they were back then, but you can't live in a television or eat it or use it to get around or something. So consumer electronics are cheaper, and some other consumer items. A lot of those cheaper items are of much lower quality than they once were, so had to be replaced more often. So it's not necessarily a net gain there, because consumer items are cheaper. People have access to much more credit now than they did say in the early 1970s. That gives the illusion of having purchasing power, but in reality it's not. They're just borrowing money to try and make up the difference between the purchasing power they once had but now no longer have. But let's just look at purchasing power on its own. So say in 1970 compared to today, and the purchasing power of the paycheck today is about 40%. I mean, you can play with the numbers a little bit here, but it's about 40% of what it was. That's how far the purchasing power of the paycheck has declined. Now, particularly, it's in the essentials of life. So it's in mortgages, house prices. It's in rent. It's in energy, gasoline, petroleum. Gas or oil for your heating your house, electricity, that sort of stuff. That's all gone up, and so has fresh food. So an example being beef. Fresh food's gone up in price. Processed food, heavily processed food, like those frozen meals you pull out and put in the microwave, they're even slightly cheaper, I guess, than they were 50 years ago. So it shows how much technology and food processing's come along, I guess. But for fresh food, it's more expensive. Bread, even if we look at the bread index from 1970 to today, bread is more expensive in like for like. So for the essentials of life, the cost of living is now vastly higher than it was 50 years ago. And there are a number of reasons for that, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The only difference is consumer goods in the area of particularly consumer electronics. But also if you look at clothing, I mentioned this before. I was going through the attic and going through some stuff that had been stored there for quite a while. And there's a T-shirt that I bought years ago, and it's made in America. I mean, the quality is very good, and put it through the wash, and I could have bought it yesterday almost. Whereas T-shirts that buy now, you're lucky to get one year or two years tops out of them, and even then they look faded and look like they're going to shit before you chuck them out. So anyway, that's the sort of the backdrop to it all. So what can be done? Why has the standard of living dropped so seriously since globalization began? Was it a few things? A lot of the better paying jobs have been sent offshore. There've been a lot of immigrants brought in to compete for jobs in the West, and Western jobs being sent offshore. Some of them, good middle class manufacturing jobs have been sent offshore, and jobs that would allow a worker to live a modest but nonetheless a middle class lifestyle. So there's a lot of those have gone, and also with the bringing the immigrants in, that's put downward pressure on wages. Similarly, as soon as there is any upward wage pressure anywhere in the West, whether it be driving trucks or anything else, the knee-jerk and immediate reflex response from government and from business is to bring in a whole bunch of immigrants from wherever they can find them. And bear in mind that most of the world, other than the West, most of the world is dirt poor. Most of these, basket case dirt poor countries, unemployment's like 80% and that sort of thing. So they'll jump at the chance to come to the West. Not necessarily just for work. Most of them are coming for the free stuff, but they'll nonetheless come, and that'll have a downward pressure on wages. The globalists perceive that wage inflation is the biggest threat to their wealth. So that's something that they'll tolerate market rigging, they'll tolerate or cartel pricing, they'll tolerate any amount of anti-commercial behaviour. But market forces pushing up wages, they will jump all over that in seconds flat. And But interestingly, if you look at senior executive wages, they've increased more than 100-fold, since 1970, whereas worker wages have declined by more than half. So it'll give you an idea as to how they view competition and wages. Their own wages can be 100 times greater, but your wages, they got to go down, and that's the only solution. But there are a few things that we can do here. We can reintroduce proper market competition. Now, the globalists perceive market competition as something that costs them profits. Why would they want competition? Why would they want to put the effort and time into being the best, having the best product, having the best service, having the best price, offering the best deal? Well, they don't want to, and they're not concerned about it. So they will have effectively each market segment has a computer modeled, algorithm type driven pricing structure, which all the companies in that space will, or most of them, will adhere to. So they'll be the price leader, and then the rest of them will fall in sort of behind that in various ways. Now, sometimes they differentiate their product by features, like they might give a longer warranty, or they might give leather seats in the car, for example, that sort of thing. So they may compete on some of the features and benefits and that sort of stuff. But basically, their pricing is all within the range. And if you look at that in pretty much any market segment, the pricing structure is designed to maximise the profits of the corporations and the companies in that space. So they're not particularly competing anymore, or certainly not as they maybe once did. Now, there's a lot of antitrust or laws against collusion and anti-competitive behaviour, but Western governments are now controlled by the globalists, and they may jump on a few flunkies every now and again to make it look good, but basically they just look the other way when all this market rigging and price fixing takes place. So we need to return to market competition. Now, so if you want to be the best and you want your product to be most successful, then you have to have better innovation, better research and development, better organisational structure. You need to have top-notch people who know what they're doing and who get out there and legally, obviously, kick ass and do what's necessary to make the company successful by giving the best service and having the best products and or the best price or a mixture of all three. And so we need to return to that, and that's been lost completely. And we really need to revisit that in a big way. Now, I don't think anybody minds buying cheap consumer products that are made in China, but the reality is it's a false economy. Most of these things fall to pieces shortly after you buy them. I've bought tools that are made in India or China and bought a wrench, and pretty much the first bolt that I try and do, the thing just breaks off in a hand or a ratchet, and then the ratchet breaks off, and so on. Some of the stuff is very poor quality, and so it's cheap. But if it's such piss poor quality, then what's the point of being cheap if that's the outcome? So there's the quality issue and manufacturing to a certain standard. If these basket case economies like China and India and whatnot had to, well, not so much China now, but if they had to manufacture to the same quality standard as you can get manufactured in, say, the United States, then they couldn't do it for that price. It'd be a much tougher gig for them to do that, and they just be a lot less competitive, certainly at the price point level. So those are issues to do with competition and price. I guess the other thing is with real estate now. This is a very important one because certainly in Australia and elsewhere, I've seen in Britain and the United States, we've got the big financial houses, big time Chinese investors, Chinese in particular, are buying up swathes of real estate. Entire suburbs, entire villages are being bought up, and in Sydney alone, there are Chinese, and many of them Chinese real estate investors who have bought 250 plus each freestanding properties. Now, when you've got a few thousand of these guys running around buying 100, 150, 200, 250 properties each, then they can start to own an awful lot of real estate, and that artificially pushes up the price. Now, because they're money laundering, they don't have to earn their money by working hard. They're making their money by just having lots of buddies in the governing body, lots of buddies in the government. So they make a lot of money without having to themselves work hard or be competitive or do a good job. It's just pure cronyism. And then they need to launder that money. So they go in and buy Western real estate to launder it, and that washes it out when they sell the real estate. Then they've got clean money. So that's the gig. And they're buying hundreds upon tens of thousands of properties all over Australia, as an example, and Sydney. There'd be many tens of thousands of properties in Sydney that are owned by just a handful of people. Now you add to that the recent, and this is part of the globalization and the universal basic income scam that's being again foisted on Western populations without their approval. What the big banks and so on are doing, the big financial houses. They're also buying up lots of properties, again, whole suburbs and whole villages. They're buying up these properties and they're sitting on them and then renting them out. So that too, and they don't necessarily care what they pay. Now, there are certain tax breaks in most countries, and Australia is one of them, that people get when they invest in property. They're able to offset the cost of property ownership against revenues they may have in other areas in terms of negating taxation. So it gives them a good tax write-off sort of thing. Now, if you've got a guaranteed cash flow coming through the front door, as these businesses do, and then they also can use these tax write-off schemes, then it becomes a massive fucking scam. And this is what they're doing. So they're owning all this property using tax advantages that are just not available to the ordinary citizen. And I've been looking at, say, property auctions, and you go along and you see the younger people wanting to buy their first house maybe, and and say the reserve price, that is the anticipated, or the alleged anticipated price, is 500,000, say, for the property, and it'll sell. With China, a Chinese investor will buy it for 900. They don't give a fuck what they pay because they're just laundering their money. So they can pay 900,000 without blinking, but the local family that wants to buy a house, they've got to borrow the money. They've got to make sure that they've got enough income to pay for it, and this and that. They're also thinking how long do they have to postpone having children for. They've got to make real life decisions on the ground as local citizens, not like the blow-in investor that comes in that can walk from, and I've seen it, walk from property to property to property and just buy each one. And they've got interpreters, but I speak Pastel Mandarin, so I can hear what they're talking about and where they come from. They're talking with Beijing accents most of the time. So anyway, this is part of, so we need to revisit the tax scheme to discourage offshore investors coming in and artificially bumping up the price of property, of housing, and in turn artificially bumping up the price of rent. Now, rent for a basic property 50 years ago, rent would take up between 15 and 25% of your income, your net income. Whereas today, a lot of, particularly at the lower end of the average, rent's taking up more than half of the income. And they've still got to buy food and so on and get around. So that shows just how tight they're living, or the cost of living, how tight it is for them. So the property and the tax and the offshore investors need to be discouraged, and the tax system needs to make it less attractive, far less attractive for people to hoard hundreds upon hundreds of houses. Again, because they can pay pretty much what they want for it, which artificially pumps the price. Now, the taxation system, you still got to, if people want to buy a few houses, maybe they want to buy houses for their kids or something, that's fine. But any more than, say, 3 houses per person, and then it's just not a family investment anymore. It's a fucking scam that's artificially distorting the economy, and this artificial distortion is particularly the issue. So those are some of the things. Now, the other thing that's being allowed is that Western countries are selling off their farmland to, again, China and other offshore players, international players. So that land is either not being used or it's being sat on, which is decreasing the amount of land for things like running beef cattle or growing crops and so on. That needs to be looked at. And the national interest, this Australia is Australia for Australians. It's not, doesn't exist for the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party or something like that. So those things need to be addressed. They need to be done sensibly and reasonably, but again, it overvalues the property so that farmers on somewhat marginal land, instead of improving their techniques of growing crops and running sheep or cattle or whatever, because the price is being artificially pumped by Chinese buying of farmland, they find they're getting pressured by banks and the financial institutions. They will sell to this Chinese investor. We're not going to loan you any money, so they artificially squeeze the farmer to sell the property, and he gets a good price for it. So that's fine. But there may be 3 or 4 generations of farming, so that expertise now gets lost, and then the farmland sits there doing nothing because it's owned by some Chinese investor that wants to launder some money. So there are a number of small things. Now, the other thing is to do with bringing workers into the West. Most of the time, substandard workers being brought in, they're not matching the caliber of the local worker. So the substandard workers are coming in. There's various schemes used as tax write-offs, as say a labour hire firm in India or China will then transfer the people to the West, to America, Australia, or whatever, and so the wages are then paid overseas under a different tax scheme. So They avoid taxation in a way that couldn't be done. Some of the wages are retained in, say, India and then dispersed to local family members in India. So that there's a it's a bit detailed, so I won't go into it here other than to mention it in overview. So there are various tax lurks and scams, tax avoidance in this case. We can call it tax minimisation, but the intent is to avoid tax. And these things are being used which disadvantage the American worker who doesn't have access to those sorts of scams and tax minimisation schemes. So by bringing in these workers, it undermines not only the wages, but it also undermines the skill levels, and makes why would American workers want to increase their skill levels when their job will be given away to somebody from India who's half as skilled anyway. So there's the incentive to do well, to study hard, to do a good job, to be competent in one's profession, master the subjects and so on. So that has a knock-on effect of course, people just not trying as hard as they might, or putting in as good a job as they might, because their job will be given away to someone who's half as good anyhow. So here's just a few things that could be done. So just by stopping the very tight ownership of just a very small number of people owning property, that could reduce property prices by between 35 and 45%. So and that would need to be staggered and staged so as not to cause some market rout, but and then return it to market forces, the ability of the people to buy property from their own income. And that's critical here, because if their income declines, they can't pay as much for property. So property prices decline, and that's how market forces work. But we've got the reverse at the moment. As the Western population's income is declining, property prices are halving, property prices are doubling, which is impossible. It's impossible as a market economy, as a play for a market economy. So adding competition, reducing the tight ownership of real estate, making it less attractive for overseas goons to come in and launder and wash their money in the West, and to stop semi-skilled migrants being brought in to replace skilled local people. Just these things alone would have a capacity to return the standard of living that the Westerners used to have. And if purchasing power declines, so do prices. That's how it works in a market economy. But we've now been disconnected from that by the globalists, who amass profits to themselves while causing a decline in standard of living for Western citizens. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.